Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you and welcome to Islam on Life with me Tariq Ramadan broadcasting from London. In today's show we ask the question, what is the image of Muhammad, peace be upon him, in mainstream Western society?
A national poll conducted by YouGov shows that 69% of people believe that Islam encourages the oppression of women. Only 6% of people associate Islam with justice, and again a mere 6% believe that Islam promotes active measures to protect the environment. Overall, nearly half of all people in the UK believe that Islam does not have a positive impact on British society. These views have directly affected the image of the Prophet, peace be upon him. To look at the issue from a Westerner's perspective, Islam and Life will investigate what is the image of Prophet Muhammad in mainstream Western society.
It's an important question after the crisis, the cartoon crisis in Denmark and in other countries. What we heard about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is quite worrying about the image of Islam and the understanding of who was the messenger, peace be upon him, and what is his role within the Muslim community. So these are two programs that we'll have on this discussion. The first is really about the perception in mainstream Western society, and we'll have another program on how it is the Prophet, peace be upon him, is perceived from within the Muslim communities and also the Muslim majority countries, and another vision of his presence and his role within the Islamic tradition and within the Islamic communities in the West. Let us today focus on this image in the mainstream Western society, why the perception is so negative, what is the perception that we have towards the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself, and in which way this could be understood and reformed from within and among the Muslims, the European Muslims, the Western Muslims in the West, but also, of course, in the Muslim majority countries. So to answer all these questions, I'm joined by Myriam Francois Serra, an author and the spokesperson for Inspired by Muhammad campaign. Myriam, thank you for being with us today. Let me start with your personal journey towards Islam, because 7 years ago you converted to Islam. Before that you were a Westerner, you were looking at the Muslims, looking at this Islamic tradition from outside. What was the perception that you had at that time of the messenger, peace be upon him, Islam as a whole, and how would you explain this perception?
I think I had a very negative perception of Islam. I come from a sort of French background, attended a French school, so I had a number of friends who were Muslims by culture, Muslims by background. And I always saw Islam as something that was sort of holding them back, sort of an element of repression. I deemed religion in general actually to be something that was, well, an opiate, if you like, something that was holding people back from sort of real mental emancipation, and was coming at it from the sort of tradition of Sartre and, you know, humanism. And so I really looked at anybody who sort of adhered to a religious outlook as having, you know, adhering to fairy tales, really. Any
religious backgrounds?
Any religious background, and specifically because we tended to find that, you know, apart from a small minority of Catholics that we find in France, most people don't really practice religion that much, except for some Muslims who do hold on to certain elements. So I generally had a fairly negative image of Muslims until I got to university. And I think it was the first time that I encountered practicing Muslims, and it was the first time that my stereotypes were challenged by practicing Muslims. So,
okay, let us speak first about the Prophet himself. What was the image that did you remember? Which kind of perception we had about the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself, and beyond? Of course, this was before the crisis, the Danish cartoon. So before that, what kind of perception did you have?
Well, I think the main thing that I can say is that I obviously regarded anyone who followed the model of a man in the 7th century to be absolutely mad. I mean, why would anybody model their life in the 21st century on a man in the 7th century? That was my main image. But I think aside from that, I had all the sort of sometimes we can say little information is dangerous, so snippets of information. I knew that he'd had several wives. I knew that one of his wives was very young, and so a lot of these things, culminated in this image of this power-hungry imposter. I think stuff like, it's strange to say that now from where I'm sitting, but these were the images that were fairly widespread, and I think are fairly widespread today.
So you would say that if you have to assess what is happening now in the West, in Western society, is still or even more this perception than it was for you before you converted to Islam?
Certainly, I think the perception of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has got worse. So in addition to some of the stereotypes that people had of a kind of warmongering, power-hungry, lustful man, astaghfirullah, which was what we saw, we now have, in addition to that, the sort of real violence that people now assume is associated with him. And sort of, obviously, one of the main issues is the decontextualization of specific events within the Prophet ﷺ's life. And of course, the way that we have received this information, I mean, the tradition of Orientalism and the whole idea that the information that we have about the Prophet, peace be upon him, was filtered through specific objectives. I mean, the way that the West started to learn about Islam was, of course, through the Muslim world's occupation, as they saw it, of the Holy Land, of Jerusalem. Information was acquired in order to defeat the Muslims. It was acquired in order to buttress support for the Christian Crusades, in order to ensure that people really had an understanding of Muslims as very different to themselves, as the Prophet is very different to their Prophet. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, just saying something about the Orientalism as something which is one of the causes that we have to understand what is happening today. Now, if you look at what the people are saying, and the Western societies, what we have, the ordinary citizens, but also some of the intellectuals and some of the people who know about Islam, they studied Islam. You say, first, yes, that's true that there is a great deal of ignorance. Second, you cannot deny that within the history of Islam, and especially the way we are dealing with the Prophet's life, peace be upon him, and sometimes idealizing everything which happened during that period of time, is also one of the causes. And then also you have people who know about Islam, and especially there is an agenda. It could be a political agenda, ideological agenda. If you look at what is happening now in the West and this perception, negative perception, we just got this, more than 60% of the people are talking about Islam and are connecting Islam with discrimination of women. 75% in the country where you were living in France are connecting Islam with injustice. And at the center of all this is the image of the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him. If you have to look at what is happening now, what is the main cause, according to you, when it comes to assessing what is happening in the West and this image, this negative perception of the Prophet?
Well, I mean, I think an important statistic that was also in the same YouGov poll was that 60% of people say they don't know very much about Islam, and 60% of people also say that the information that they do have, they get from TV. And so we have to think about TV in the way that media picks up, of course, on the stories of the day. And some of the key stories, unfortunately, that will mark our generation are terrorism from Muslim extremists. And so I think, unfortunately, there is the necessary link that some people make between the religion of people who claim to be acting on behalf of that religion, who claim to be modeling themselves on the Prophet, peace be upon him, in their actions when people do come to understand Islam. So I think that's going to be the main reason why we see that. The other reason is, of course, the legacy of Orientalism. So if you go to any library today and you pick up books prior to sort of the 9/11 sort of, if you like, momentous surge in books written on Islam, the books were based on knowledge which was acquired, as I said, through a very specific objective, and that was knowing the other in order to defeat them, knowing the other in order to buttress support for war
so there is
against
an
the Muslim
agenda
world.
and there is ideology behind the whole presentation, and this is something which is known in Orientalism, and that we have to deal with this, and it's still there, and sometimes it's colonizing even the Muslim minds,
Of
because
course.
the Muslim minds are repeating exactly what they got from this these sources. The point is that when we have to deal with violence, very often what we have in the West is, you know what, the image of Jesus, peace be upon him, is exactly the opposite of the image of the Muhammad, peace be upon him, because this one was all for peace and love, and the last, the messenger and the prophet of the Muslims is about war, and it's about, you know, battles. The second part of his life is dealing with war and jihad, and their understanding of the central concept of jihad. So what is your take? After now you became a Muslim, you studied this history, this period of time. If now we have to think about solutions in which we can change the perception. We will have another program. The second part of this will be on, you know, something that could be the perception from within the Muslim communities and from within this understanding from Muslims. But if we think now about, you know, this Western understanding, how would you start just to change this perception and say, okay, this is the problem and this is what we have to do?
Well, first of all, there has to be a historicizing of knowledge. So any book that one picks up, one has to be aware of the general atmosphere and the time in which it was produced and the conditions under which it was produced and the reasons why people sought out specific knowledge. And I think the other thing to be you know, aware of is that, you know, a lot of us are leading by example. So you know, a lot of information that I personally acquired about Islam and that helped me change my views of Islam was through interaction with, as I said, practicing Muslims who really showed me a positive image of Islam and who would always refer back to the Prophet, peace be upon him, in their behavior. And of course I found that very strange. As I mentioned, I couldn't understand how anyone in the 21st century could model their behavior on somebody in the 7th. But I had to recognize that what they were modeling themselves on, the values that they were sourcing, were positive values. They were values that I recognized as objectively good values that were enhancing their lives and the lives of people around them.
So it's through their example that you got a better understanding of who he was?
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
Would you say that this is the priority for us in the West as Muslims, is just what to do what exactly? To behave the same way as he was behaving?
Well, of course, as Muslims, that's what we aspire to do, inshallah. But I would say that, yeah, I think the most important thing is outreach to people around us and to make sure that we do always adhere to the ideals of our faith and to not betray them because of circumstance, which can sometimes be there and sort of seek to arouse a reaction out of us, and to remain, as I said, true to those ideals. But of course, there are lots of other ways. I mean, the Inspired by Muhammad campaign was set up in order to confront some of these stereotypes, some of these misunderstandings, and to show that you know, beyond these snippets of knowledge, these snippet stereotypes that people may have, you know, the average Muslim in the UK is inspired by the Prophet, peace be upon him, to do good in a variety of spheres, be it social justice, the environment,
yes, but
women's rights.
Like what, practically speaking? Because, you know, just after the cartoon crisis in Denmark, you know, we had Muslims reacting in a way which was very emotional and sometimes very violent, not really in the West, but in Muslim majority countries. But still we had, you know, discourses coming from Western Muslims. They were not violent, but they were very, very hard and very much against the West per se. And say, okay, look, if we want to give an image of who was the messenger, peace be upon him, it's exactly the wrong thing to do, because it wouldn't be his way of behaving with people criticizing him, because this was not the way he was doing with people around him.
Right.
He was just much more intellectually and spiritually showing more empathy with the people, trying to understand from where they were talking.
Yeah.
So I was saying this to Muslims, and the perception sometimes for Muslims is, oh no, you are too much on their side, you are not too much trying to. So what is exactly what you are trying to do? Because I really think that this is the heart of the question, is if we want to change this negative perception, we really need to have a vision in which way the Western Muslims or the Muslims, when they are dealing with the mainstream society, By the way, the mainstream society is not per se against Islam. They don't know. They just have this, you know, the TV programs,
Right.
and they are watching TV. So what is exactly, on the practical ground, what are you trying to do?